Well, we're now going to discuss the current state of the conservative movement. And John is going to be joined, or is joined, by Paul Kengor of Grove City College, and by, and by Jeffrey Lloyd, former television newsman at CNN, now on Newsmax TV, a local resident and a real favorite of the PLC audience, and somebody who we need to listen to as much as we can. I will be the first to admit I don't watch enough Newsmax TV. I am going to come back from this PLC with a personal pledge to myself to watch more of it, because these are voices we need to hear. Paul Kengor has been at Grove City for 27 years. He has written 20 books. He is one of the world's most knowledgeable experts on the phenomenon of Ronald Reagan. And in general, he has his pulse not only on the history of the conservative movement, but also the current state of it from the perspective of the college campus. That's a voice we need to hear and we need to understand. Jeff Lloyd, as noted earlier, has been a journalist in and around the conservative movement for basically his entire career. He has been inside government. He has worked directly on campaigns. He has worked within an administration, and he has worked as an independent journalist. He is a great observer of what is happening in the conservative movement generally. So I'd like you to welcome all three of them, the two of them who have just joined us, and we'll begin our discussion in just a moment. So my first question is to all three of you gentlemen. John talked about some of the history of the conservative movement. He's the only one in the room, I think, that could go back to Robert Taft, but several of us, several of us at least have studied and remembered Barry Goldwater. I was a college freshman in that year, and I remember standing out like an odd thumb at the very beginning of my college career by being a Goldwater supporter on a campus where I think the Goldwater supporters could have all met in a phone booth, for those of you who remember what a phone booth is.
Pretty good. I like that.
But whether it's from Reagan or from Goldwater forward, or you want to talk about some of the other influences on the conservative movement, like William F. Buckley, some of the other intellectual foundations, as John indicated, it is typically a set of issues and principles that has characterized the conservative movement. And various people have come along at various times and become the standard bearer, the personification, the face of some of those issues. And even though Ronald Reagan only had one job, one political job before he became president, everyone else had had multiple, some appointed, some elected, but they were all familiar with the political world. Ronald Reagan was governor for 2 terms of the largest state in the Union, so he had an opportunity in 8 years to pick up a lifetime's worth of experience. So they all came along as the standard bearers for the set of issues which was considered the basic set of the conservative movement. Some people referred to the 3-legged stool, which had to do with economic conservatism. The whole idea of smaller government is one leg, another leg is a strong military, robust foreign policy, and the third leg is the set of family issues, life, and so on. What we've seen with Donald Trump is quite different. He is truly a phenomenon. He did not hold any political position. He never ran for election until he ran for election to the highest office in the land. One could argue that he comes to the conservative movement not as its issue-based standard bearer, but rather as a unique and distinctive personality who has adopted some of those issues. So I would like each of our three panelists to address the question of the phenomenon of Donald Trump this way. How has he affected the conservative movement? How is the conservative movement of 2024 different than the conservative movement of up to, say, 2015, before his arrival at the foot of the Golden Escalator in Trump Tower? How has he affected the conservative movement? And in particular, I want to hear from Paul about how he has affected it on a college campus. Gentlemen, have at it. Let's start with Paul, and then work your way down. Paul, Jeff, and then John.
Yeah, thank you, Colin, and it's great to be back with Jeff and John. We really look forward to this every year, even though it's so damned early in the morning.
Don't you have early morning classes at Grove City?
I don't. Afternoon classes. Afternoon classes. Yeah, but in fact, one of the courses I'm teaching this semester currently at 1 o'clock. That's when my classes start. Yeah, PM. And it's on conservatism, so I should be well briefed to answer this question. But conservatism really shouldn't change, and that's really the whole point of the conservative philosophy. And if you want to go through, I won't try to go through a long history of the movement, but two intellectual founders of the movement, even before Buckley and before Reagan, would be Russell Kirk,
right,
who wrote the Roots of American Order. And he wrote the 50s, 60s, died in 1994, died about 30 years ago. And even further back, Edmund Burke, who was a member of the British Parliament from the late 1700s. And Burke talked about this eternal contract between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born, right? And there was this understanding of basic values, principles, what T.S. Eliot called the first principles, the permanent things. Russell Kirk said it is an enduring moral order. So conservatives believe in an enduring moral order. Reagan would have defined conservatism around issues like Colin just said, freedom, faith, family, limited government, peace through strength, which is kind of a foundational belief of conservatives, right? That the way to have peace is to be strong in the first place. That way you don't have to use that military strength. Reagan said, John mentioned earlier, Putin and the Russians. Reagan said, we learned long ago that when you're talking to the Russians, negotiating with the Russians, you had to approach them with a dove of peace in one hand and a sword in the other, right? So you could only work with them from a position of strength. So those are all basically foundational issues, ideas, principles. And for Donald Trump, he doesn't come into the movement as an intellectual, right? He probably doesn't know who Burke and Kirk were, right? But he comes into it probably, and Jeff, you'd probably agree with me more on this, maybe a kind of more populist conservatism, perhaps, right? Certain basic beliefs in certain core American values, patriotism, love of country, certainly limited government, small government, free market economics. And I'm really pleased to say, and I think when we did this probably 5 or 6 years ago, longer than that, 2016, I would have said then, and I did say this back then, I didn't think in any way Donald Trump would be a cultural or social or moral conservative, especially on issues like abortion, for example. But he ended up being the best pro-life president we ever had. There's no question about it, and it was really, really kind of stunning. I mean, Ronald Reagan could have probably articulated the position better, but Reagan gave us 3 appointees, Supreme Court appointees. You guys want to name them?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Kennedy,
disaster, absolute disaster.
and we all remember Justice Bork.
Bork didn't make it through, and Kennedy got the Bork seat.
Sandra Day O'Connor.
Sandra Day O'Connor. And
William Rehnquist.
And William,
After elevating
to Chief
Rehnquist,
Justice.
naming Antonin Scalia.
Scalia. So Reagan was 1 out of 3, basically. It's certainly on issues. I mean, Kennedy and Sandra Day O'Connor were terrible on the life issues. In fact, read Kennedy's so-called mystery clause in his Casey v. Planned Parenthood decision that upheld Roe v. Wade. Trump gave you the 3 who overturned Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey. In fact, Justice Alito said, as of this day, both Roe and Casey are overturned. So Trump on Supreme Court picks was 3 for 3. And remember the Amy Coney Barrett pick. I mean, that came right at the end of the term, almost. And there were people even on our side, this gets to what Dinesh was saying last night, who were trying to play by the rules of the left and saying, well, maybe you shouldn't appoint anybody just right now. MSNBC and the New York Times don't want you to. The liberals are going to be mad if you do that. They're going to be angry. He said, well, too bad. And so he named Amy Coney Barrett anyway. But so on Trump, I'm giving a long answer to your question. I should just go to Jeff here next. Yeah. I think it's more of a kind of populist conservatism. I even call it kind of like a Midwest conservatism, although he's a New Yorker through and through and through. And strong on defense and limited government, free market economics, patriotism, and surprisingly good on cultural, moral, social issues, surprising to me. I didn't expect that. He's been better on that than I thought.
Well, I have to say, having worked for President Reagan, I went back when Donald Trump started running to look at what was being said about Ronald Reagan in the day and found all of these people, Republican establishment figures of the day, saying literally that Ronald Reagan was an extremist.
Right.
That if he were ever to be nominated, it could be the end of the Republican Party.
End of the world.
End of the world. I mean, we're talking about people like then Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, Illinois Senator Charles Percy, on and on and on went the list. And
Page 1 of the New York Times.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And I remember reading an article in 1965, if you recall the story, on October 27th of 1964, Ronald Reagan gave a speech which became, sort of propelled him into the political world on behalf of Barry Goldwater. And in 1965, the New York Times ran a front page story saying that the California Republican establishment was absolutely panicked because they thought, my God, he's really going to run for governor of California and we're going to get clobbered. As it turned out, he won in a 1 million vote landslide, message there. And by the time we got to Donald Trump, I remember I sat down with him. The first time I met him was in 2013, and I interviewed him for the American Spectator. And we talked and talked and talked and talked. And I thought to myself, wow, this is really a conservative guy here. And if he ever does run, I think he could win. And of course, I put this in print. Yes, Trump can win. My friends thought I had absolutely lost my mind. And I sort of stuck with it. And by the time...
I thought you had lost your mind.
Me too.
Yeah.
And once he was nominated and everything, and I was on CNN, and he loved the fact that I always compared him to Ronald Reagan. Mm. And I did so because I thought, they're both outsiders to the political establishment. And Donald Trump may not have spent a lifetime in the conservative movement, but he was, to my way of thinking, indeed conservative. So it was good to talk to him about this, and he was. I always laugh when I think about this story. The first time I met him in person, and I go to Trump Tower, and they take me up to his office, and we sit there and everything, and then we're going to fly to Washington for an American Spectator dinner, at which the attractions were he and Ted Cruz. And so we go down the elevator, and there's like a back lobby to the Trump Tower main public lobby, which has all these stores and restaurants all tied to him. So we're headed out the door. I can see the limo out there waiting for us, and he says, we're going to take my citation. Al Gore's always giving me grief about the 757. We're going to take my citation. It'll get us there faster. 28 minutes. So we're starting to walk out there, and he says, oh, wait, Jeff, come with me. Takes me by the arm. We go into the main lobby, and my political brain instantly realizes he's literally swarmed with, the tourists in there, and they all recognize him. Oh, Mr. Trump, oh, Donald, can I have a selfie? All this kind of thing. I thought, wow, this is pretty amazing. He takes me over to a men's tie counter. They're all Trump ties. I had looked at them when I came in and thought maybe I'll get one, and then saw that the price was something like $80 a tie. I thought, thanks, but no thanks. I am not Donald Trump. Well, so he takes me over there and says, pick one. I said, no, pick one. I said, okay, that one. He says, pick another. Oh, no, pick another. I pick a second one. And then he turns to the girl behind the counter and says, okay, and give him that one, and give him that one. And then he points to a shelf up above and says, oh yeah, and give him one of those. One of those was men's cologne, Success by Trump. But you couldn't make it up. And so we get on the plane, and we're flying to Washington, and we're getting ready to land, and we're sitting across from each other, and he says, I've got to go comb my hair. And he sits down, he says, I don't get the fascination with the hair. Barbara Walters wants to touch my hair. Greta Van Susteren wants to touch my hair. And he goes like this, and it's decidedly his hair. And he goes like this, pulls it back. He says, I'm worth $10 billion. Don't you think with that much money, if this were a toupee, I couldn't get a better one? But I have to say, I really think that not unlike Ronald Reagan, he has made a real impact on this country. And as we're saying here, he got those justices confirmed, and I knew it. I thought that he would be able to deliver. And I don't think we're done with that story yet. So I'll turn it back to Colin.
John, follow up, please. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much.
I might add as a postscript, or should I say by way of disclosure, I was one of those who never believed Donald Trump could be nominated for president. And at the 2015 PLC, I got up and said exactly why. And I was followed by Jeffrey Lord, who told me why I didn't know what I was talking about that day.
Politely.
Politely. Two things that should be noted in the analogies of Reagan and Trump. First of all, when Ronald Reagan made that speech that Jeff mentioned, A Time for Choosing, in October of 1964, he essentially said everything that Barry Goldwater was being pilloried for, including the idea of making Social Security voluntary, if you want it, and of privatizing the Tennessee Valley Authority. Yeah. And yet, he received rave reviews. It brought in the most donations for any speech that was done, and some Goldwater biographers have said it was the best thing that happened to the campaign, possibly the only good thing that happened in the general election. And of course, it launched his career in the same sense that William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech launched him to the presidential nomination of his party. That was pretty amazing at the time. And one thing was that Reagan was a familiar fixture. He had hosted a weekly television series, two in fact, for an aggregate 16 years. When he decided to run for governor of California, a poll showed 83% of the Golden State's voters knew him, and he had a very positive response from voters, even though they didn't know his stands on the issues. Fast forward to Donald Trump running, and I never realized this, but Jeff touched on it. He had a prize-winning television show, an Emmy-winning television show for more than 10 years, which was very popular. The Apprentice, and it evolved into the Celebrity Apprentice and other formats. And he was quite known, and hence you would see people wanting a selfie, wanting his autograph. I never made the connection, but I have a friend who is a French journalist with La Figaro, Laura Mandeville, who decided to write a book on Trump, and she made this comparison that, like Ronald Reagan, he was liked by people across the political spectrum because they saw him on TV and liked his program and his persona. And I might add that that book came out the week that Trump was elected president, and it became a bestseller, and it was the first European biography of Donald Trump, and saw it coming. The effect for the future. Ronald Reagan reached across party lines. He was the first, and I think Paul has noted this, the first former union member ever to become president. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild, a card-carrying member of the AFL-CIO, and that certainly was an entree for him to bring blue-collar voters along. Donald Trump has continued this. There's no Reagan Democrats anymore because they've mostly become Republicans. But Donald Trump has reached out to other groups, to current actual Democrats and union members, doing so on the issue of trade primarily, but certainly on other issues where he's connected. And we are seeing the Teamsters and other unions seriously discussing an endorsement of Donald Trump. I might add, that would be only the first time since 1972 that the Teamsters have given their endorsement to a Republican. And I believe they've done it overall 3 times. And that would be a pretty historic moment and a blow to Biden and the Democrats. Similarly, I watched Donald Trump speak to an all-black audience in South Carolina, and he definitely connected. And he made a comparison. He said, Joe Biden brags in his book about working with Democratic segregationists in the Senate. I've worked with black people all my life to help them get good-paying jobs and to start their own businesses. And he pointed out, and the New York Times has written about this, he said, anyone remember Mitt Romney? And of course the audience all booed. He said, he got 4% of the black vote. I got 16%, and polls show me now getting 20% and more sometimes, up to 28. And then he paused and thought aloud, as Donald Trump frequently does, and said, 28% of the black vote. We don't even need to have an election if that's true.
That's true.
And indeed, polls show the Hispanic vote. Younger, entrepreneurial Hispanic, or, third generation of the families who are now voting, they, like him, up to 40% of the vote, and that would be the highest since George W. Bush's reelection in 2004 for a Republican nominee. So when I said earlier, it's not your father's conservative movement, it isn't, and it's not your father's Republican Party either. Right. Just as Ronald Reagan changed it by bringing in new people, so does Donald Trump.
By the way, if Reagan got only about 10% of the black vote. I mean, if Trump gets 20% of the black vote, it's over. Yeah. I mean, it's. I think the problem with Donald Trump compared to Reagan. I was just looking at the Real Clear Politics composite average just about an hour ago, and Trump leads Biden by 1.1%. And by the way, if Trump wins the overall popular vote, it's over. I mean, if he comes, If he was to lose to Biden the popular vote by about 1 or 2%, he'll probably win the Electoral College. If he gets more popular votes than Biden, it's over. But I think Trump has a ceiling of about 47%. The good news is Biden probably has a ceiling of about 46 or 47. But Reagan got 60% of the vote, 59% to be exact, in '84. And he beat Carter by 10% in '80. Reagan won 49 out of 50 states in 1984. So Reagan did have this much larger, broader likability that Trump simply doesn't have. But Trump doesn't need 59% to beat Biden. He needs about 47. And as of right now, he's there. This is the first, I mean, he's been leading overall in the polls since about October. And he never had that kind of a sustained lead in the polls in 2016 or 2020. So if this holds up, he could probably win 300 Electoral College votes. Wouldn't be even close.
One postscript I'd add to what Paul said is that we're now just starting to discuss the impact of third-party candidates in the race.
RFK Jr.
RFK Jr. I would have always guessed he would take votes from both candidates if the nominees are Biden and Trump. On the other hand, others tell me, who analyze the figures, that Donald Trump, you are either going to vote for him or against him, that no one has a choice and then say, well, he or she is not on the ballot, so I'll vote for Trump. With him, it's black and white. And that any third-party candidate would hurt Biden and not Trump. I might add, in 2016, the Libertarians did the best they ever did with a very impressive ticket of 2 former governors, and they got 3% of the vote. The next time around, they ran no one, and so there was no or they ran an obscure candidate. Jill Stein ran on the Green Party ticket in 16. The Greens ran no one next time. And what that means is that in contrast to 20, you are going to see next time substantial third-party candidates, RFK Jr., Jill Stein, and the educator Cornel West.
If RFK Jr. can get on enough states, but he could get 13% of the vote, and I think the Trump lead over Biden probably turns into a 3-point lead. I think RFK Jr. picking Nicole Shanahan was just a huge blessing for Trump. I mean, he didn't pick someone more moderate or maybe right-leaning or somebody. They were talking about athletes, Jesse Ventura, Aaron Rodgers. Not that Aaron Rodgers is going to be playing football next year in New York. But of all people, he picked a lefty, and that ends up hurting Biden.
Collectively, the combination of all of those people helps Trump, without question. And, thinking of Robert Kennedy, I always have to tell this story because it reminds me that Joe Biden is sloppy. He's not, he's not a concentrated thinker. His career...
That's a nice way to put it. Civility, right, John? Rod Serling.
So I got to tell you this story. So back there in 1988, well, when I was 17 years old, I was a huge fan of Robert Kennedy's father, namesake father, Bobby Kennedy Sr.
Right.
And when he died, tragically assassinated, my Nixon-loving mom got on a bus with me. We lived in Allentown. I was in high school. We went to New York City so I could stand in line for like 2 hours in the June sun to touch the casket at St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Wow.
And shortly thereafter, they started, record companies started producing these long-playing records of Robert Kennedy's speeches, and little geek that I was, I sat in my room for hours and memorized them. Okay, flash ahead to September of 1987. I'm now a White House political director for President Reagan. We've just come through the tumultuous Robert Bork hearings, chaired by Joe Biden, who was also running for president. His opponent for the nomination, Governor Michael Dukakis, runs an ad that shows the Labour Party leader in Britain, Neil Kinnock. Why am I, he was Welsh, why am I the first member of my family to have an education, to do this, et cetera, et cetera. And then they stop it, freeze frame, and go to a Joe Biden speech. Why am I the first member of my family from Scranton to do, coal miners, I mean, the whole thing.
The first in 1,000 generations.
Yes, yes. So the Biden people respond with Biden saying, oh, it was just a mistake, I don't do this. This is where I came in with my memory. Back in February of that year, we'd had a snowstorm in Washington, and as everybody familiar with Washington knows, DC shuts down, people panic. Sure. I'm working in the White House, I live close at hand. So I go into my office, I'm the only person there, no phones ringing, nothing. I thought, well, what do? I turn on C-SPAN, and there is Joe Biden addressing the California Democratic Party convention. And I thought, well, I'll watch this, he's supposed to be a good speaker. So I'm sitting there, and suddenly I begin to realize I'm getting to the end of his sentences before he is.
Oh, beautiful.
How can this be? And I said out loud to myself, my God, he's plagiarizing from Bobby Kennedy.
Yeah.
So that's February. We're now into September, and this whole Neil Kinnock thing comes up. And he says, oh, I don't do that. I knew differently. So in a position to do something, I picked up the phone and called Maureen Dowd of the New York Times. And told her, she says, you're kidding. Can you prove this? I said, sure, Maureen, I'll run home to Pennsylvania, get my Bobby Kennedy records out, and I'll have them in your office by Monday morning. I did. That was Monday. By Wednesday, there was a front page story in the New York Times referencing me, saying that Biden's speeches are drawing scrutiny, et cetera, and going through all this. Within a week after that, he was out of the race. And my point is, what a dumb thing to do. Mm-hmm. I mean, Robert Kennedy Sr. was one of the most famous people in his day. To think that you could plagiarize from him and no one would notice is just not, So
they might miss Neil Kinnock, but not Robert F. Kennedy.
Yeah. So, my only point is this is the mindset of the guy who's sitting there in the White House. He is not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And contrast that with Donald Trump, and I think we've got a very good chance here.
Jeff, I'd love you to follow up that wonderful anecdote with your own analysis of what I call the death of journalism. The whole concept of journalism as a profession, as opposed to the 19th century with so-called yellow journalism, where every newspaper, every media organ was solidly in one camp and would just rip to shreds the other, and it was filled with inaccuracies and so on. The journalistic profession decided to elevate itself, create schools of journalism, talk about balance, talk about integrity, all of those things. Now it seems that we have slipped back into the 19th century model of journalism. What is it like to be a journalist today in a profession that has basically abandoned its ideals?
Well, I have to laugh. I have a column coming out later today at Newsbusters, and I'm answering a guy named Chris Quinn, who is the editorial editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And he wrote a piece chastising Trump supporters for accusing him in the paper of being anti-Trump and biased and all this kind of thing. And he goes on at length that we have to speak truth to power, and that we are unbiased and we just say the facts. And of course, all the facts are that, in their view, that Donald Trump is a terrible human being and yada, yada, yada. So I wrote this piece and I said, look, this guy, he actually says in there that we're about truth. And truth is our true north. And I said, whoa, here. You're so biased, you don't even get it. You can't see it. And you are not, objective about all of this. And you make quite plain in your article that you can't stand Donald Trump. I said, okay, fine, just be honest about it. Don't pretend that you are.
Or label it as opinion.
Yeah, yes.
Not journalism.
Right. And what they do is, they run these stories. And it's one thing if you've got an opinion piece on the editorial page or the op-ed page or the New York Times, wherever. But it's another thing when your front page stories are all tilted in one direction, and that is what has happened.
And they don't seem to even notice. It's like they're genuinely oblivious.
Yes.
It's like, no, what do you mean? They don't even get it.
They really don't. We've got 3 minutes left. I'd love to focus on the future for just a moment and ask Paul what it's like on your campus. Now, Grove City is generally a conservative and Christian campus, so it's likely to be different than, say, the Ivy League campuses of today. But nonetheless, it's a new generation with new perspectives. What is the feel, the tone and tenor of the Grove City campus insofar as the 2024 presidential election is concerned?
Well, I mean, we're totally different, right? I mean, so we're an outlier compared to the other campuses. I mean, we're doing a conference next week on anti-Semitism and focusing on October 7th, and Vice President Mike Pence is coming in, and I mean, there's no pro-Hamas demonstrations on our campus, right? So we're very different. We're kind of like a shining city on a hill in education, right? To quote from Ronald Reagan. I'd say generally though, campuses across the country, I mean, we're in big trouble. One demographic I would point out, we only have 2.5 minutes, so I can't really go into this, but there's a major shift going on right now with a lot of young people. Our generation, you were supposed to go to college, right? That's really changing now, and especially with young men. All right, and young men don't want any of this woke BS. They don't like the DEI stuff, and they're going to trade schools. They're going into the military, and now the vast majority, and it's continuing to increase, people in college are women. They didn't need the ERA for this to happen. This just happened naturally. More women in medical school, law school. So that's a big demographic change going on in colleges.
The military.
And it's going to, unfortunately, politically speaking, it's going to continue to make guys, I think this is good, right, more conservative, but it's going to make women more liberal. And it's going to, kind of like the young, white, woke woman, right, on the college campuses. And my friend Scott McKay, who writes with us at the American Spectator, talks about how it's also creating a marriage problem between young guys and young girls because they're so in totally different universes politically, ideologically, that they're not getting married. So there's these things are going on. We only have a minute left. I better stop there. But Grove City College is blessedly totally different than all the others. That's why I teach there.
That's a note of optimism. Our time has run out. I want to thank everyone. We could go on for another hour. Yeah. Maybe next year we can get Lohman to extend the period of time. But
not earlier.
I want to thank you. I know John's got something else he wants to add right here at the end. I just want to thank you all, and I'll let you go on past where the red stop sign shows up, John. But let's express our appreciation to Paul, to Jeff, and to John.
Thank you.
You got the last word, John.
One thing to keep your eye on, it'll be interesting to watch the Libertarian Party, whether in the name of ballot access and publicity, they give Robert Kennedy Jr., who is in no way, shape, or form a libertarian, their nomination, or stay with a lesser-known figure who nonetheless shares the leave me alone principles of the Libertarian Party, which has been on the ballot in just about every state since John Hospers was the candidate in 1972. One other thing, Colin mentioned this in his introduction of me. I had the great pleasure of personally seeing the first libertarian ever elected president anywhere sworn into office when I went to Buenos Aires December 8th and watched Javier Milei, one-term congressman, television pundit, all be sworn in as president of Argentina. And now he has to unearth 80 years of statism and government spending that began when Juan Perón came to power in 1944. And he's doing it. It's going to take a while, but 70,000 government employees let go. Programs to subsidize them when they're not working, being eliminated. Now, he has some bigger ideas, including dollarizing the peso. In other words, using the US dollar as the standard for the currency in Argentina. That will take a vote of the Argentinian Congress, proposed by the left.
John, are you going to be writing about this where we can read it?
In Newsmax, I wrote about it, and one postscript. I interviewed a lot of people. I did man on the street interviews, or woman on the street, senor and senorita on the street, for Newsmax television when I was there. And what's interesting is that the younger people and professional people understand what he's doing and that things will have to get worse before they get better, and they're supportive of it. And that is something to look at. And someone who is fearless and doesn't care what people think of him.
Be interesting to watch.
Be interesting to watch.
Speaking of watching, everyone in this room should begin regularly to watch Newsmax TV.
And read the American
Newsmax
Spectator.
and also read the American Spectator.
Yes.
And you won't recognize John until you see his hat.
So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlemen.